Welcome back to The Line. Last month, Governor Martinez appointed Michael Brasher to the UNM Board of Regents. She also appointed him to the State Board of Finance. Mr. Brasher cited his ongoing service there as relevant higher education experience, qualifying him for the position as a regent. Now, as an article in the Journal points out, some lawmakers and government ethics advocates say service on both boards could pose, Dan McKay, a conflict of interest. What are the arguments, however, for Mr. Brasher? Is there a way to keep a separate track here, even if UNM type issues come up before him? How's he going to manage this process?
Well, Brasher has a good reputation as someone who has served on a lot of different boards, the County Commission, the City Council, the State Board of Finance. He really has not run into an ethics question before. I think part of what troubles people in this particular case is that neither he nor the governor would address how he might handle a potential conflict if one comes up. So we're left wondering.
Right. Do we have a sense of what those conflicts might be? It's easy to say all things UNM, but that's a little wide. Does it also include other campus activities, say in TAUS, grants, all things UNM? Do you know what I mean? And perhaps even CNM related, since he has a history with CNM as well. How does he work through that?
The State Board of Finance does a lot of important work involved in loaning money, helping government agencies essentially. So there are all kinds of potential questions that people might raise about his work.
Right.
And he just has not addressed what he will do if a potential conflict comes up.
Right. It's almost like we'll see how it goes, kind of a thing, as we've left it now. Laura Sanchez-Rivey, the idea that Vicki Harrison, someone that's here at our table quite a bit from Common Cause, she's executive director. She has some serious questions about this ability to split duties. Do you share those concerns? Is there a way in your mind that one can be both on the Finance Committee and a regent and have them work out for both parties?
So sort of full disclosure, my firm does a lot of public finance work. I do some public finance work also. We have issues that come up before the State Board of Finance, so I want to be very careful to keep this general.
Appreciate that.
But I will say that, it's incumbent on each person who's appointed to any board to be familiar with the Government Conduct Act and to disclose potential conflicts of interest and recuse themselves from any particular vote where conflicts of interest should arise. A lot of those conflicts of interest address specific personal conflicts of interest, but I think when you are a public figure, as Mr. Brasher is, and sitting on multiple boards, I think it's important for him, and given his government experience, I think that he's in a position to evaluate that and really be able to. We have to have the faith that he has the ability to evaluate that appropriately. When conflicts come up and he's having to sort of serve two masters, it's important to recuse yourself from a vote that could impact another master that you serve.
Sure.
So I think that's something that he certainly has the experience to be able to do. It's interesting that he's been appointed to do two different boards. I think there's a lot of people who would be interested in being on either one of those two boards.
Good point there.
But he does have a wealth of experience to be able to bring to both positions. And I think that the fact that there hasn't necessarily been a clear statement about how he's going to address that doesn't give me necessarily as much concern, because I do think that each person, and not just on these boards, but in any public position, they're obligated to disclose any conflicts and to recuse themselves when a conflict arises. And it's really up to the public at that point to discern whether they've done that effectively or not.
When I think about this, Sophie, the mechanics of how this works, if you have a regent that's recusing himself over and over and over on unit, is that fair to the university? Are we getting a full vote, so to speak, from the regents on things if one member has to constantly recuse?
I mean, it seems to me the issue is not so much that he's recusing himself from UNM matters within the Board of Regents, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but it's more that when it comes to votes at finance, that he may have to say, you know what, this would involve giving money or to UNM. It's been brought up too, should there be concerns not just about CNM, but Western or whatever, other higher ed institutions in the state. I don't expect that will become something that he also has to recuse himself on.
Gotcha.
All higher ed. But I mean, I think it raises this question: is it good for UNM to have a regent who is on the Finance Committee? Certainly in terms of insight into the finance process, it could be quite useful. But it does mean that they lose a vote on that committee that they at least might have reason to believe would be reliably pro-UNM. So So you know, I think there's a lot of concern around the state. Is this going to help them unfairly? And I think that if Mr. Brasher does what I would expect, which is to recuse himself pretty frequently when UNM comes up, that advantage is not going to occur.
Right. But I could also see situations, Dan, where if Mr. Brasher chooses not to recuse himself, someone else may have an issue with it. Do you see what I mean?
I
still
hear what
being
you're
in
saying,
this
but I don't
vote.
understand why. I mean, the sheer, I don't know the definition of the conflict in the government. You got to be gaining something from this to have that conflict. And the fact that he's not gaining anything by his work at UNM, and he can advocate for that work at the Board of Finance, and UNM is the beneficiary, they're all public entities. So it's not like he's in a for-profit or a private board and he's going to be advocating
He's
for
not
them.
like self-dealing.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to recuse himself. I think he's going to be able to help UNM, and I think he's going to try to help UNM, and I think he should try to help UNM. That's what he does. That's where he is. He is a vote on the Board of Finance. It's not that he's got to recuse himself for the public's sake, because I think everybody knows he's on the Board of Regents and he's on the Board of Finance. I think he's going to have a more difficult time trying to make an impassioned plea to other members of the Board of Finance that aren't going to dismiss him automatically and say, you're all UNM all the time. But at the end of the day, they're both state institutions. To me, this is not any different than talking about in the legislature that individual who serves on the Appropriations Committee and is in that committee and is understanding how the appropriations bill is drafted, saying, well, when it comes to the House floor, they've got more time with it. They really shouldn't be speaking or voting on it. No, it's all going to the same place, both state institutions. I don't see a problem with it. I don't think that there's going to be a problem. I think other schools are going to get angry.
Let me ask you this in 20 seconds for you. Was this, let me back way up here, was this a good choice by the governor?
No, not at all.
Okay.
There's no lack of people that want to be on Board of Regents. Probably wouldn't have a hard time. Wouldn't have a hard time finding someone to be on the Board of Finance. I mean, I don't understand. Other than you're going to try to help fix the UNM problem, which I think if he goes there and tries to fix the UNM problem, no one should be surprised. No one should be startled. No one should be, aghast at what he's doing. It's government money trying to fix one governmental entity. It's another example of why schools like New Mexico State, East and West, and all those schools are frustrated, because every time this stuff happens, UNM seems to get some sort of a golden parachute from somebody somewhere that wants to help them within state government at the expense of all the other institutions.
But isn't this administration not so friendly to UNM? I mean, I can't see them.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because some days we'll hear how they hate UNM, and other days we'll hear how they're carrying UNM's water. I mean, to me, maybe it just means that they're doing the right thing on some things, because everybody's mad at them all the time.
That's right. Thank you all. Good stuff on a Friday night. Really appreciate it.